Good evening everybody, and welcome to BrisScience for December 2021, special Christmas edition. So great to have you all here, and of course online watching through our website at home. I'm Joel Gilmore, your MC for this evening, and this is of course BrisScience, Brisbane's free series of public lectures on science brought to you by the University of Queensland. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting tonight, and of course those watching at home, and pay my respects to elders both past and present. And we are, for those here in person, we are here at The Edge, our wonderful venue partner here at the State Library of Queensland. It's great to be back. Tonight we're going to have a fantastic speaker. We would normally have food and drink afterwards, but just as we got the tail end of COVID, we're just holding off on food and drink for a little bit longer, but that absolutely will be back next year. We're not just trying to cheap out on you or anything like that. So you have to go home and have your own fruit mince pies tonight. We will, of course, at the end of the talk, be taking questions, and we're doing that tonight over a web platform. So if you have got your link there, bit.ly/BrisSciQA, or there was a QR code, if you put your questions in there, we will get through as many of those at the end as we can. Or you can post on Twitter, #BrisScience, and we'll respond to those as well. But of course, if you have your phone, if you could put it on silent, that would be fantastic. Unless you've got a really great Christmas ringtone or something, and then maybe we'll let it by. So, there guys, this is our Christmas edition of BrisScience. I do need a segue to tonight's topic, and a little bit of a stretch, but I'm going to go with the fact that many of us are gearing up for some pretty big Christmas lunches over the next couple of weeks. Certainly I am. And it really puts into focus our global food system and just how many fantastic foods we have access to, and how important it is that we continue to have access to a sustainable food supply into the future. Did that segue work? Good. I'm going to run with it. So tonight we're going to look at how we can unlock the next step changes even in agriculture, using technology to help to deliver that sustainable future. And to fill us in, I'm very excited to introduce Professor Scott Chapman from the University of Queensland. Scott is a crop physiologist at UQ, where he looks at genetic and environmental effects on field crops with a strong data science bent. So everything from looking at statistics and simulations to even using, I understand, the same AI behind deepfakes. We're not talking here about really good tofurkey, but deepfake images. So Scott has previously worked at CSIRO for 24 years on a very broad range of projects, including climate-ready cereals. So it's fantastic to have him here tonight to share his knowledge on a broad range of topics. Please put your hands together and welcome Professor Scott Chapman.
Thanks very much, Joel. I thought I would bring this hat just to prove that I do actually wear it. That's actually my beach hat. It's also my field hat. I bought it in northern Thailand, and I guarantee that it's really good for sun protection. And I'm glad to see I've got a few of my students and postdocs and people here tonight, and thank you very much for coming, the rest of you. So, slides. I have to work out how to control the slides. So I thought I'd start with this because I had a few students in the audience. This is what I normally do when I've got control of the whiteboard. So that's a model. That's an explanation of response to heat. That little yellow there is heat, because I didn't have the touch screen. I was trying to draw with a mouse. And that's my approximation of something I was trying to explain to some data scientists when I was trying to work out and explain to them what I wanted them to do for me. And you had to watch it. Unfortunately, I don't have a video of me scribbling it all, and I'm not going to give you an exam on it or anything. But what I was doing was relating my, unfortunately, 30 years of experience in crop physiology to describe how crops grow in response to climate, and trying to explain to them how can we use machine learning to answer some questions. Fortunately, I'm not going to stick with that. I've got lots of other pretty things. The first pretty thing I've got is this beautiful piece of art by Madeleine Holt. So if you go to the showground, I was so upset that RNA cancelled this year, because it was the year that I got to have a piece of street art I was very fortunate that the university joined with the Brisbane Street Art Festival and painted this beautiful thing. Well, Madeline painted this beautiful thing. Well, I don't know whether it's good or bad, but Madeline got inspiration from what I do, and she came up with this beautiful mural, which is a translation of the lots of types of data that I collect on cameras and satellites and sensors, and put together to try and tell the story of what drives crop yield and how's it work. And you can see Maddie was pretty happy because she was nearly finished at the point, and it's still there in Gregory Terrace at the top of the hill, right next to the traffic light. So if you get a red light, you can look at it for however long it takes. So please do, and look up Madeline's work. She's a local artist in Brisbane and does some beautiful stuff. So here's a much more standard kind of sciencey, heavy-duty graph. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I really only want to make the point that this is yet another recent paper. This one came out, I think, in July by some colleagues in Wageningen University, who are #1 in agriculture in the world. UQ's #2. I don't know how many people knew that, but we're #2 in agricultural research in the world. These are from our #1 friends, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining it, other than to say to you that they're still confirming that by 2050, we're still going to have a food demand that's about 50% more than now. So all these graphs here, this is sort of total consumption, this is per person consumption, this is total consumption. And these different colours here are some different sustainability models. So there are different assumptions about how we behave in our economic models. So if we're, if we're fossil fuel, we can make it, we can feed everybody. And in here, this is the number of people who are going to go hungry. So that 800 million is the number of people who are going hungry right now. And if we keep going with fossil fuels, well, we're going to reduce it by about 90%. But we can also reduce it by 90% by using a sustainability model of how we do agriculture, how we produce food for the world. And if you want to learn more about it, I'll have to ask you to read the paper because I haven't got enough time to interpret it all. But the key thing is that climate change is going to increase that a bit. It's going to make it a bit harder, another 5 to 10% harder to get there, and a higher risk of people going into hunger, depending on which one of these scenarios eventuates. But I think the important point is actually a lot of the food demand is simply driven by these factors: population growth, economic development, urbanisation, and other drivers, and climate change is a small amount of it. I know it takes a lot of the press, and I believe in it, just in case anyone wants to ask me, because it changed in my lifetime. I'm old enough to have seen it happen myself, and it is affecting our demand. This is a little bit more contentious, and I'll come back to this. So this is a group of respected scientists in the US. I know quite a few of the people on this paper, and Europe, in fact. And they've been doing some analyses of corn and wheat. Corn is also known as maize. And projecting it out to 2100 with climate change scenarios. And what they're showing is that in a lot of parts of the world where corn's produced, it's going to come down in yield. And that's where a nice piece of crop physiology comes into play, because corn's a C4 crop. So it has a special type of photosynthesis that doesn't benefit so much from the increased CO2. So if the CO2 is going up, we know the CO2 is going to go up to about 1,000 ppm by that time. And it's only about, 500, a bit under 500 now. And corn won't get much benefit from it. Wheat will get benefit from it, because wheat is a C3 plant. It has a different type of photosynthesis, and that's going to allow it to benefit from the higher CO2. And what it means is that for wheat, particularly in Australia, you'll be able to grow a wheat crop, and it will take in a bit more CO2 because there's more CO2 in the air, and it will still use the same amount of water. So that means that it'll get more growth for the same amount of rainfall, and that'll be a benefit. All right? So that's why the wheat yields will go up and the corn yields will go down. Unfortunately, these guys seem to think that the yields are going to go up quite a bit in Australia, and I have to tell you, there's no Australians on that paper, and if there were, they probably would have pointed out the fact that it seems unlikely that this is the real scenario. And we'll come back to that. The type of research that we do in agriculture at UQ is very diverse, but it's part of a building better, sorry, first mistake with the slides. Can I go back? Yes. Building better bioeconomy. So trying to look at the whole system. I mean, a lot of people are well aware of the fact that food waste is one of the biggest problems in the world in terms of our food system. And if we could save all of that food that we currently waste, we don't, you know, we've got a few more years up our sleeve before we have to catch up with population demand. So all of our research is sort of done inside this structure, and we're mostly here, but we're trying to leverage a lot of technology from other parts of the university. I put this one up because I really like this slide. I usually print this out and I put it on my desk. It's the Farm Tech Landscape 2020, and there's $40 billion worth of global investment in farm tech in 2020 alone. So you've probably heard that it's a popular area of investment. I'm not recommending that you put your money in there. Choose really wisely, but there are some really big companies involved in that, and I don't, you know, agriculture is a productive industry and well worth thinking about. I'm going to mention here a couple of applications of AI that I'm not going to talk about in detail, but I wanted to tell you about them because these are things that some other people at UQ do that I'm quite excited about. So Professor Ryan Coe is our chair of cybersecurity at UQ. So he's the guy who keeps all of you safe because UQ actually does look after cybersecurity for the whole country to some extent. We have a really, one of the first units to do that. But Ryan's been working with a PhD student and our postdoc, Joshua, who's working on a project with us now in grain supply chains. And one of the things that they were doing was looking at traceability. So apart from cybersecurity, Ryan's got a big interest in traceability and provenance. He started some work in New Zealand in that space. And what this does is it actually uses Google Glasses to track cuts of meat to make sure that they come from the carcass they say they came from, and it's validated so that when you get to the other end, you can put your Google Glasses on and look in the box, and it'll say, yep, that's the meat that was packed in Kilcoy or wherever it was, right? So these are some of the useful tech that I'm not going to talk about anymore. And this one, which I think is really cool, I worked with these guys and talked them into applying for a grant, and Guido is a fascinating guy. He's a lecturer at UQ, and he works on natural language processing. So there was a request from our Grains Research Development Corporation, GRDC. They wanted to invest in some research in search engines to make those search engines work really well for farmers. And so there's this massive database of sort of grey literature, right? It's really easy to find all the stuff that I write, but it's not necessarily easy to find all the stuff that's presented in the conferences or in the farmer updates or in the other, you know, GRDC has this massive archive of you can call it grey literature, but it's all that literature that is collected over time. And so they designed this conversational search engine, and they've put it on Telegram. So I think if you look for Ag Ask on Telegram, you might be able to find it. I don't know whether it's working just a minute. It was working the other day because they did a project update and I saw it working. And this was a nice example. This was one of the first ones they did, was Ag Ask, slugs are destroying my crop, what should I do? And it uses the information on your phone to find out where you are, and it says, well, you're in the Darling Downs, so here's a project that someone did on controlling slugs, and I'll give it a try. And he says, oh, you better wait 2 days because it's going to rain tomorrow, so just, you know, not a good time to apply pesticide. So a really cool application. Agriculture, an opportunity for data science engagement. Something I like to tell my students in my first lecture that I get to give in the year. I don't get to teach till third year usually, so sometimes I get a chance with the first years. They let me loose, but Usually they come and I get them in crop physiology in third year and try to inspire them a little. And I guess one of the things I like to say is that agriculture is one of the first sciences that we ever developed. So I guess you could argue that, the ecologists might argue that they did a better job before we did it all in agriculture, because otherwise we would have all died of some poisonous plant or animal. But agriculture really was one of our first sciences ever. And for the last 10,000 years, we've been breeding crops. So farmers have been breeding crops for 10,000 years. And I like to tell my students, and agriculture has been stealing off everybody ever since. So every time there's been a technological advantage, or development in some part of society, agriculture has looked at that and said, what can we do with that? A lot of people think agriculture is just, farming, driving around on a tractor or digging something up, or labour is, working hard and needing people from overseas. We do need those people to help us harvest our crops. But just remember, it's a pretty sophisticated science that's backing our food system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how some of these machine learning and artificial intelligence things come into agriculture. And there's lots of vacancies, so I've got a few graduates here. But if you've got any relatives, kids, whatever, who want to do a career that's definitely going to have a job at the end of it, tell them to do agriculture, because we definitely will have a job for them. Just checking my time to see how badly I'm going. AI is combined with other technologies. So what I'm going to do for the rest of my talk is I'm going to talk about these 4 things and how I combine them all together, and how I try to bring this data science into the understanding that we apply with these other technologies. And I've put these up here. Feel free to take a photo of it or grab a video later. But these are a couple of talks that I've done in the past, and this is a new story that's on the UQ website about predictive agriculture, which is probably the term that we're using a lot more at UQ these days, because most of our work is about predictive agriculture. Yes, it's digital, but it's predictive agriculture. So we're trying to predict what's going to happen, and whether it's going to happen in another field on next year, or whether it's going to happen tomorrow. We're interested in that. So we're going to talk about phenotyping. So phenotyping is the act of trying to understand how genetics has produced the thing you see, right? So I'm a phenotype. I had some genetics that produced this phenotype that's standing in front of you. There were decisions made in how this phenotype would look. There's one decision here that makes it a bit long. There's a more intermediate decision, which is that I only like shaving once a week. But the phenotype is the expression of the genetics plus the environment and the management. So I just told you about some management. I grew up on the Sunshine Coast, so that environment has helped me to be whatever I am, which includes kite surfing, but that's another story. The phenotype that we're trying to measure is of plants and how those plants create the yield they create. So crop physiology is about trying to understand how that comes about. How do we get that? So I'm going to give you some examples of phenotyping. So I thought I probably should give a bit more context. This is a wheat field here, and this is a trial, okay? So I realised when I walk into an agriculture class with my students, they know what these things are, and we do one of these at Gatton every year. Danny looks after ours. He's sitting up the back. He was looking after ours this year, most of it. This is not his. This is one out on the Darling Downs, but these are nicely coloured in artificially, right? They don't really look like that. They look like this. But this has been taken, this image has been taken of a trial. It's been embedded in a farmer's field. So this is part of the National Variety Trials that GRDC pay for every year. So the growers of Australia contribute levies, and one of the things that happens is that GRDC coordinates these trials across the whole country to evaluate different varieties so that we can work out which varieties are the best for different regions and help farmers to make better decisions. And my job in this project, which I'll talk about later, is how do we add lots of value to this so that we can make better decisions and we can make better recommendations. Because it's one thing to say, oh, I'll just take the data from the experiment that was nearest to my house, right? Most people might think that's a good idea. It's not a really good idea in Australia, because what happened at your house or your farm, which might have been 2 k's away, if it was a different soil type and they got a rainstorm at a different time to you, then probably it's just as relevant as somebody's farm in Western Australia, right? So what we're trying to do is work out how to relate the weather, the soil, and the drivers of performance to this, so that when I compare these 2 genotypes that are side by side, actually they're over here somewhere, and there's 3 replicates of them, so there's a pair there and they're all scattered across here, that I have more confidence in predicting what they would do next year when they're on your farm. That's what I want to be able to do. So we have these little plots to do that, and we measure them to death. And this is embedded in a farmer's field, so that's the farmer's field right next door, and we can use the farmer's field as a reference to some extent. So high throughput. What's high throughput? I was going to put up a picture of low throughput, but for me to put up a low throughput picture, I have to get permission from my students to display the pictures of them out there with steak knives or shears or something, cutting those plants and measuring little samples. Go back. So they might go into here and cut out a little quadrant and measure that, and that'll tell us something about what's been growing there. But what we're doing a lot more of is using drones to fly over this trial. So this is a trial of different genotypes of sorghum in this case, and there's some sorghum plants. And there's another piece of equipment we use a lot, which is this tractor, which has a whole bunch of expensive kit on it. So like $300,000 worth of sensors on this tractor, but it's just used to measure trials for plant breeding. And we measure all of these things, RGB camera, thermal, so we can measure how hot the plants are, because when the plants are transpiring, they stay cool, but when they're stressed, they get hot. Plants get hot like we do if they don't have access to water, so we can see that. And we can see which genotypes don't have very good roots because they'll get hot. We measure LiDAR, which lets us do 3D pictures of exactly where they are. And we also measure some multispectral and hyperspectral things, which are wavelengths that we can't see with our eyes, but we can use to characterize how the plants are growing, particularly whether they're stressed or not. And of course, we can have this at crazy scales, which I'll talk about later. I think I'm going to have to speed up a bit. Plot photos. Well, we took about 130,000 last year. I'll come back to this. I'll show you what we can do with 130,000 photos. All of this data has to go through a sensing pipeline. This is a slide from my colleague, Andres Potgieter, who helped get this pipeline going. But with this kind of system, we spent a lot of effort trying to collate that data, checking the integrity of it. We've built some tools that let us explore it and understand it so that we can put this data together and start to predict the performance of genotypes and try to understand why they perform in certain ways. So in this case, we're looking at prediction of biomass, so we're trying to estimate how much biomass is out there. I'll come back to that in a minute. And the amount of biomass that's out there is proportional to the weather and the rainfall conditions that we've had. Whoops. This is another example of what we do with that kind of remote phenotyping. Here's a wheat trial. This one happens to be in Western Australia, and you can see there's some horrible gully effect in the middle of this, making a real mess of my experiment. So I can use a drone though to solve this and try to adjust for it, because normally what's going to happen with a wheat breeder's got a little baby harvester, so it's a bit like, having your little lawn mower. It's not really a slasher. This is a little baby harvester. And you drive through the field, up and down, and you get one number, right? So you turn on the harvester, catch all of that wheat, and you got one number at the end of it, and you then calculate that for the whole experiment, try to work out what the mean was and whatever. But if you've got this effect, that poor little genotype's been affected by a terrible, Australian aged soil that's messed up the data. So what can we do with it? We can do some clever statistics with this, so we can actually model that ground cover. So this is not using machine learning or anything super clever. This is just using some spatial statistics, particularly actually stuff that I do with my colleagues in Wageningen. And we get a fitted set of data where we adjust for this error. And in this case, you find that about 50% of the final yield was actually related to this variation in cover, because this was a pretty terrible location to run a trial, and we can account for that. So phenotyping not only measures variability, it also informs dynamic models. I'm going to tell you now what a dynamic model is. Before I do that, I'll mention this. These are a couple of photos from a colleague of mine in France, Fred Barret, who's a really famous scientist in remote sensing. He invented a whole bunch of the principles of remote sensing. And Fred's done some nice work calibrating drones against cameras that are under the crop, right? So here's a corn crop with a photo taken in the morning. This is a corn crop that's a rain-fed crop, so it rolls its leaves, right? So in the afternoon, it does that. But what you can do is you can fly a drone with a multispectral sensor, so a multispectral camera. Sorry, I didn't bring one. And that multispectral sensor can be calibrated against the degree of gap that you got here, because it's really hard for us with the photos to see this gap accurately, but we can build a multiple regression model that'll do it. I haven't got time to tell you about it, but just to let you know, we can do it. So that's why we can do some really clever things with drones. Okay, crop growth modeling. We build computer models. In fact, this part of Australia, this exact part of Australia, UQ, the Queensland Government and CSIRO, developed this model called APSIM, which is one of the most cited models in the world. It's a cropping systems model. We invented it 30 years ago when I was a postdoc. I wrote the first sunflower model that was inside it, but we don't grow much sunflower anymore. I don't take responsibility for that. Canola took over, okay? You're all buying canola oil, so that's why there's no sunflower. And also, canola is actually better adapted to a large proportion of the country. But it's a biophysical computer model, right? So what that means is that all this research that we've done with phenotyping, we've used that research to measure all these processes that plants experience. So it's a bit like if I put a Fitbit on you and I monitor you non-stop, I can predict things about you, and I can also predict things to do with your health. And that's what we kind of do, but we put a model, we use a model to do the Fitbitting rather than just sticking a Fitbit on the plants. But we do put lots of sensors on plants. And fortunately, we can still do that. Switzerland a few years ago actually came up with a plant ethics legislation, which didn't get passed. It was one of those, citizen-initiated referenda in Switzerland, which would have prevented scientists from actually damaging plants in their research, which would have been really difficult for us, I can tell you. It's one of the things that we do appreciate. It's really important that we have ethics declarations and procedures for animal science and for human science, and we do that, but it would be rather challenging if I had to get permission every time I wanted to stop watering my sorghum plants or my wheat plants. Anyway, so these models take daily inputs of weather, soil, water, and so on, and we can model how they grow through the season, and this is real-time modeling that a farmer can do to make decisions about how to do a better job of what they're doing. This is my favorite diagram. My students even get to have this in the final exam. I'm not going to explain it all, but it's environment information driving all the way down to grain yield, and these are all the processes that we have in our model to capture all of that dynamic. So all the phenotyping we do is about measuring all of this. And to go back to that point I made about the global change, high impact papers that are not always right. This is some work we did not so long ago, I think it's 2015, where we looked at drought and heat stress in Australia. We looked at this part of the world, all of this area. If we looked at 33 global climate models, it's going to get hotter. There's not going to be a big change in the rainfall, a little bit. But by 2050, 2070, we're going to get more heat with no drought and more drought and heat, those two. And the number of seasons where we don't have drought or heat, this is in sorghum, is going to go down. So we're going to get basically more heat, not too much change in drought occurrence. So we've analysed this with these models. And the yield impacts, you can see they're all negative. The nice thing in sorghum is that, you know, these are different projections from, you know, 2030, 2050, 2070. With sorghum, for heat, we've already got heat tolerance. We've demonstrated, Joel mentioned the climate-ready cereals. We demonstrated that a few years ago. We can use that heat tolerance in plant breeding to improve adaptation. For wheat, a little bit more challenging. And in fact, the heat is going to knock our wheat around a lot in this part of the world. This is not all of Australia, but certainly doesn't quite line up with what those conclusions were from the global study. So now I'm going to talk briefly about sorghum. I did say food and fuel. We've done some work on predicting biomass across the US. These are just some maps of weather across the US and different types of sorghum. So we can model different genotypes. I won't explain exactly how they differ. This is a grain sorghum, this is a sweet sorghum, this is a photoperiod sensitive sorghum and a photoperiod insensitive sorghum. This photoperiod insensitive sorghum will grow huge. It'll look like sugarcane. It's really a massive plant. And we can see where they will work best in the US, for example. This is a Department of Energy funded project in the United States. And we also did some analysis. This is about the genetics of that, which I don't have time to talk about. But just to simplify it, here's some of these sorghums. These are experiments that we've done. And we can model these processes of this is what the leaf area looks like. This is how we can model how big those leaves get. And we can understand how much light they catch over the season, and we can predict their biomass with these physical models. So if you know what a regression means, that regression is showing you it's pretty good model of what's going on, and we can then use that model in future weather scenarios or anywhere else to predict the performance, and that's what we did. So we looked at it across the US, and we could see parts of the US where you could produce fuel with sorghum. You'll be glad to know I'm not going to spend any time on this one. If Mark was here, he could give you a really good rundown on it, but I just did want to point it out, the other types of models we use. This is part of the new ARC Centre for Excellence for Plant Success in Nature and Agriculture. In that centre, we're combining these crop simulation models with genetic models, so we can predict the genetic potential in the future of all of these crops, and we can learn from nature what other adaptations we might be able to use. So it's an important part of our science. I won't talk in detail of this. Obviously, I don't have time to go into the details of that. And the other thing I wanted to mention, even though I'm a crop scientist, I wanted to mention this bit. This is some great work on digital twins being done in Quaffy's horticulture group. So Quaffy's the Queensland Alliance for Agriculture and Food Innovation. It's funded by the Queensland government, providing money to the University of Queensland to employ people to do research in agriculture. And Licky Hahn and these guys are doing some really nice work in this space, building digital twins of how crops grow so that you can start to experiment and look at all of this stuff of what does a crop look like and how much does it change depending on the management. So these are mostly structural models, and what we're doing now is we're trying to work out how to build in that biology that we've been modeling in the other models, right? So these are mostly structural models, but you can do cool stuff like this though, which is something I really like. I only saw this slide the other day and I said to Licky, can I please use that slide? I love it. But he can do things like looking at how do you best work out how do I spray that crop, and there you go. You can work out how much hit and miss you get. So that's a challenge for one of my new PhD students down the back. Chris, that's your job. But we've got to do it for wheat, which is going to be a lot harder. Okay, I got a couple of slides about remote sensing, and that's about detecting change over time. I'm not doing too bad on time, speaking of time. I think most people are aware that satellites can see a pretty high resolution. So there's some satellites out there that can read your number plate, kind of. Not the ones that are, you know, catching us speeding, not yet. But I just wanted to mention that there are different levels of this. So we're using drones to measure some of our trials, and we like doing that because we get really high density data. But in Australia, that's a big problem, because if you look at this is our set of trials that I'm trying to measure. So they're spread across 5,000 kilometres. Each of these is, well, we have a few that are close to us, but each of them's sort of, you know, 200 or 300 kilometres from somewhere you could get a beer or something like that. But the point is that for me to pay someone to go and visit that trial and fly a drone costs me a lot of money. I won't tell you how much because it's commercial in confidence, but it's 1, 2, 3. Yeah, it's got 4 digits in it a lot of the time. And it's a bit, you know, we can't always do that. So one option is to start to use these really good satellites. So Sentinel-2 has been up since 2016. It's 10 meters, 10 bands. We can't see our little plots with that, right? There are little plots. Pleiades at 0.5 meters, we're starting to see it. So we're starting to see structure in here. So what we've done is for all of these sites for the last 6 years, we've gone and found all the trials, and we've drawn little boxes around them on the satellite, and we automatically downloaded every bit of satellite imagery we can, which is sort of weekly or monthly, depending on what it is. And we're building machine learning models to try to connect our UAV data to satellite data. Because machine learning models are really clever at filling in missing stuff. So they can try to unmix the pixels, if you like, and see things that are, well, we can't really see are there. And they can basically increase the resolution. So you know how in those like James Bond movies and stuff like that, and they go, let's zoom in. That's what they can do. It's a clever way of doing it. They're applying machine learning to zoom in. Okay. I don't have too many more of these because if I did, I'd be stealing Andres's talk. And this is just to show you that we can get similar data. When we scale it up to 10 meters, we can get the same signal across the season. So this is Sentinel-2, and these dots are, Sentinel-2 is the blue and the orange and the grey lines. And then we've got Planet, which is the 3 meter one. And these dots are just single dates that we got with that 0.5 meter. That's Pleiades Airbus. So the nice thing is it lines up for the trial, so we can use it to understand the trial itself. Then we want to work out, can we downscale to see the plots? And we're still working on that. Other things I wanted to mention here, this is a great new project, again, led by Andres. I'm in this project with him. And we're trying to look at all the crops in the country, work out what's in every paddock, and predict what its yield's going to be. And we're a long way there, but I'm going to leave it for him because hopefully I'll ask Dom to ask him, Andres, to give one of these talks. But just to show you a little bit of it, this is our crop type discrimination model with machine learning. So we had, I can't remember, 100,000 fields or something down in Victoria, and we know what crop's in every one of these pixels, and we can work out what crop it is because we can look at the sequence. So the way you do that is you get the satellite data for every pixel of these fields, and you can start to build up this signal over the season. And each crop's got its own signal if you look at it over time. So you're using a machine learning algorithm to work out what that crop is. And we're doing pretty well on some of this. It's getting up around 90% precision for discriminating amongst 5 crops. So you don't need to tell us what crop you got because we already know. Okay, we can see it from space. And that's helpful because what it does is it helps us understand what this, grain supply system is going to look like for the whole country, for example. And I guess the other thing, it feeds into our supply chain models. We have some other work on supply chain, which I can't talk about today. I don't have time, but this technology's accelerated so fast. It's pretty impressive. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is the true AI, and it says, how am I going for time? It's about 10 past 7. Really? I put my clock on. Oh yeah, started at 6:30, didn't we? That's all right. Cool. I was worried. Field cameras. All right, so watching wheat grow. It's not so exciting. That's a trail cam, so that's the same one that you can use to watch birds and live, animals run around the bush or whatever you want. It can take little videos, so if the wheat sort of goes, it can take a video of that wheat. It's not much fun to do that. We just tell it to take 4 photos a day, which is a bit of overkill because we don't really want 4 photos a day. It doesn't change that much. But the reason we were taking 4 photos a day was because of lighting conditions and trying to improve our systems to do that. So Swanti put this together. She's our data scientist. And there's a few missing ones here, so these red ones are gaps, but these all have little Telstra 4G chips in them. It's part of the reason some of them don't work, because the network's not totally covering the entire wheat belt, which is fine. I can tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, but what we want to do is replace these cameras with machine learning cameras, which I'll come to. And if we can replace them with machine learning cameras, the machine learning cameras can look at the wheat growing. They can make a decision about, how much has it grown? It's got 52% cover. Okay, so cover is something we use in our models. And then it can just send the number 52 back. It doesn't have to send the image back. Or it can tell me if it's flowering, and it just says flowering. And I can send that back over the new NB-IoT network. So Telstra built this network that covers the whole country. It's amazing. The narrowband IoT, Internet of Things network. And it can only transmit little bits of data. Can't send images with it, but you can send data with it, little trickle data. Like if you've got a dam and you want to know if it's full or not, it can send that. So that network is what we want to use next, because then we don't have to try to send images when we don't have any coverage. So for those ones, we have to go and download the data chip at the end of the season and get the data. But anyway, we can take that image and then we can process it with some pretty simple machine learning. Well, it's not really machine learning, it's just decision trees. And then we can look at how it changes over time, so you can see through the season how those different sites are changing. And that's something that we can use to calibrate against the satellite. So we've got a camera in the field, calibrating against the satellite, telling the satellite, or not telling the satellite, it's not talking to the satellite. Forget that bit. But it's telling us what's going on, and we can calibrate it against the satellite so that we can understand whether the satellite is seeing a lot of cover that's light green because the plants are a bit sick, or it's seeing less cover, but the plants are quite green and happy, right? So we can tell the difference because if we've got a camera, we can see that on the ground. It also can tell us, or tell our technical teams, quick, you better go out there and do these other measurements across the whole trial. So they go out and take notes on which ones are flowering, things like that. If they've got a camera in the field, we can see that. Object detection. Okay, I should really ask Chris to come and give his talk, but he's letting me talk. Object detection and counting. I saw that there was a talk from Brian Lovell in 2019. If you really want to know about face detection and stuff like that, go and watch Brian's talk. Don't listen to me. I'm an ag scientist, what would I know? But Brian is really a world leader in that space. But I just wanted to illustrate here that there are two methodologies you can use. You can detect things with bounding boxes. So you're thinking, you're trying to draw boxes around everything. And so the way that you train those models is you draw boxes around everything. And let me get this. Hang on a sec. Oh, here we go. I was going to ask Chris to come and do this, but I haven't plugged it in. This is a machine learning camera, which we're going to see in a minute. I'm not going to turn it on. We were going to count all of you, but I decided, well, there won't be that many. I can probably do it by hand. But this camera is a full-on machine learning camera with a fancy piece of GPU inside it, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it cost $200. And 2 years ago, it probably cost $5,000. So the technology's just gone crazy. It can do that kind of stuff, right? It can count like that. You can put it in your car and it can just analyze just like your Tesla. And you can also count with points. So this is a density map. So it's trying to work out what's the probability that that's ahead, right? What's the probability that pixel's ahead? So those are two types of ways we do things. We had a great project over the last year and a half or so on counting wheat heads. So together with a whole bunch of other people, go and have a look at the data set or this paper, but together with a bunch of colleagues in, I don't know, about 9 countries, we put together this data set of 280,000 wheat heads labeled by hand with a large number of students. But it was labeled, and as the models were getting better, we get the models to do the labeling, and then we just fix it. So it does get better, but the thing is that that's now a resource for us to test models of how to count wheat heads. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work Chris has been working on in sorghum. So these are those sorghum crops again, and this is a plot of this is a single plot in the field that's in a breeding trial, and this is us trying to count all those little heads that have popped out the top. And we use 2 different types of models to do that. I won't go into the details about it, but in general, what we find is that those density models work better than these models, which are the object models. So when you see this CNN, that's usually that's a neural network model. These density models are they're actually better. But when this is on the test set, right? So they're a little bit better. This is a test set, so they're only off by 2 out of 100. But when you go to a generalization set, so it hasn't seen it before, you just take another set of photos, the CNN's smarter, right, than the density model. So it's not as good. So, but the problem is, how do we make these models general? Because that's what we really want to do. So these are, again, some nice slides from Chris explaining this. Here's domain A, training, make a detection model. You come down here and you go, all right, I've got more photos from that set. So say I took a whole bunch of photos on the same day, and I took half of those photos, or maybe usually I take 70 or 80% of those photos, and I train my model, and then I've got 30% left, and I go back and test it. It's really good. But if I go and test it on some photos taken somewhere else, it's not very good, right? How do we deal with this? And that goes back to what Joel said. I'll come back to that in a sec. So there's what happens. So what we want to do is convert them. So you've got this system called Generalized Adversarial Networks, which is the Deepfake kit. And it helps you to change those photos, and you can convert them and build a better model. I'm going to show you a bit more detail. So this, Chris, thank you, put this one up. It's a nice one. How do you make that cat look like a Van Gogh cat? You apply a style image. So this is what Deepfake tech's doing. So it's the same stuff. I'm not Tom Cruise, right? I'm not faking myself. But I know there's a Tom Cruise Deepfake on the internet. So those deepfake videos are made with this same kind of tech, basically. So we take that deepfake tech, and we can create these output images with cats, although we don't do that, somebody else does that. My colleagues in Japan do this really cool thing where they took orange trees and they changed them into apple trees, and then they changed them into tomato trees. Well, I don't know why, but at least you could imagine what a tomato tree might look like. But it's the same technology, it's very effective. But the really important thing is what it does is you see where those, if you just look at those heads, right, see where they are? Over here, they're still in the same place, but they look like this photo. All right, so this is a photo from, well, actually from Warwick, from a trial we've got down there. And here are some photos from my mates in Purdue University in Indiana in the US with totally different genotype, and yet we can make the photo look like that one. So then we can build this system. Chris and Yang have done some really clever work on this because they had to work out, well, when it makes mistakes, we have to work out how to fix that. I won't explain how you do it, but basically you can tell it how to notice when it's made a mistake. Because here's a whole lot of heads and here's a whole lot of no heads. So if you've tried to draw a box but there's no box, then we can fix it. So then you can automate the whole thing, feed it back in, and it gets really, the model gets really smart. These are some pictures, and this just shows you with 50 heads in an image, and you've only got 100 images, then with the original model you've got an error of 10. Now they almost always undercount, so you're counting 40 instead of 50, you don't find them all. But if you train it with GAN, we only miss 2. So this is getting to the quality that we need. And this is the really cool thing. This is the little brother of this guy, right? That's walking through the field in real time counting wheat heads. So you're just walking along and it's counting them, just like they do in those clever movies. I didn't see this in Bond this time. I did watch the movie. But this has a little VPU in it that does 4 trillion operations a second. So it's pretty extraordinary what it can do for 150 bucks. And Chris had it running with a $50 Raspberry Pi computer. So this is going to be kit we're going to have a lot of fun with. I'm nearly finished, Joel. Am I okay for time? So what do we want to do? I mean, we've got all kinds of crazy ideas. One of them is we want to start putting these things all over harvesters. Now, John Deere are already putting machine vision cameras on sprayers, and those can see the weeds and they can recognize what weed it is, and they can spray it with the right stuff in real time at 8 kilometers an hour, or 12 actually, on a boom that's like 60 foot wide. They can spray weeds accurately, and they spray the right product and a tiny bit of it, just enough to kill that weed. All right, so they can decrease their spray use by 90%. Guess the price of spray might go up, but you know, it's an amazing technology. But we're interested in trying to use it in understanding yield. So we're starting to put these little guys on our baby harvesters and a few other things, and drones. So I have a tiny drone there that can almost carry this, and we'll do that. And this is probably the last thing I wanted to show you is what can we steal next? Oh, borrow, sorry, not steal. What can we borrow next? This is, I'm really looking forward to playing with this stuff. This is some work from Professor Helen Huang and Yadan Lual, who's a PhD student with Helen. And they're working with Logan City Council to do automated detection to fix roads. Now, a few years ago, CSIRO and a few other people had an amazing machine that used to do this. It was worth, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Millions probably, and it was a special car with, you know, cameras underneath it and doing all this stuff. And now you can take almost a GoPro and put it through an algorithm and analyze it. This is not running in real time. This could do it in real time. So you could actually do this kind of stuff in real time. The other thing I wanted to mention is this really terrific work from Ross McRae. So one of the great things about getting to play at the University of Queensland is going, my job is to run around and find the people who know how to do stuff and then work out how to get them to do it for me. Ross has a great animation of this. So he works on precision autonomous surface mining. So this is using bulldozers to uncover coal. No reaction. Okay. And they're using hyperspectral sensors as well as really clever algorithms on these bulldozers. So they all work together to move all that dirt really efficiently by themselves with nothing, no input. They just do it. So, you know, the reality for us, if I think about it, is that Australian farming can't afford not to invest in this kind of technology, really, in the next 20 years. It's more efficient, it's more sustainable. You know, we can envisage a situation where we have all of our combines, which right at the moment, there's a whole bunch of people driving combines in Western Australia trying to get through a huge amount of wheat, the biggest crop ever. We're trying to cut 20 million hectares of winter crops right now. There's a lot of OH&S dramas with that. You imagine all those people working crazy hours trying to harvest all of this stuff. They're not doing it at maximum efficiency because it's impossible to do it at maximum efficiency unless you're a robot. And a robot can do it. And if we save $5 a hectare by having a totally autonomous fleet of harvesters, this is just for harvesters. I mean, it applies to a lot of other technologies that we use, planting and everything else. $5 a hectare, that'd be $100 million in 1 year for the industry. And in 10 years, that'd be $1 billion. You're telling me we can't spend $1 billion on buying a few autonomous harvesters or building them? Why not? So, you know, Ross works with Caterpillar. They build this stuff. They're like number 5 in the world, this MEC-Eng team. So if you don't want to do ag, do MEC-Eng. I always wanted to, but missed out. I didn't think about it. But really, there's some amazing ways and ideas that we can steal. So that's the summary. Okay on time? Thank you, Joel. Okay, so I kind of threw some words in there to explain what these things mean. There's a couple of shortcuts to talks that if you want some more detail. And I guess I did want to show this one because this is my flagship project at the minute is this one. It's funded by GRDC. It's based on a project in Europe where the Europeans got together, a whole bunch of countries, and they're spending 12 million euros trying to work out how to apply all this tech to improving variety prediction in crops, in multiple species. And, well, we knew them. We knew the people I'd been working with for years. And GRDC came to me and said, hey, can we do that in Australia? And I said, sure. Because I love going to Europe and helping all those guys out and learning how to do stuff and bringing and stealing their students and bringing them back. And then COVID came. And so I haven't been. We did another meeting the other day on this, but we're working with these guys in Wageningen. We're working with a team in France and in Germany as well. Oh, that says stop, Scott. Probably a bit over time. Anyway, and that's some of the other team who did a lot of the machine learning work. And this is my list of very long set of collaborators, including Madeline there. And don't forget to go and look at the picky. Thank you. Bit long.
Fantastic, Scott. Fantastic presentation and some wonderful tech there. I might get you to pop over to the middle of the stage or feel free to grab a drink while you're
good idea.
While you're waiting. We have questions now, so don't forget to use that bit.ly link to log on, ask your questions. We've already got a bunch that have come through here. If you're watching online, now's your chance, or on Twitter. We will, of course, be back next year. We have BrisScience for another year, and we will be back in person and hopefully with all of the food and accompaniments that we're used to. So we'd love to see you all back again in the new year, and we can celebrate the wonders of science and the fact that we can all go outside again. So make sure you sign up to our website, hop on Twitter and the like, so you are notified when those tickets are available. All right, So we've got a few questions coming through here. I'm going to start this first one from Scott, who asks, where is the investment coming from? Farmers, food manufacturers, scientists, industry?
Everywhere. There's a lot of pent-up demand for investors, I guess. And there are a lot of investments in vertical farming, lots of that kind of stuff as well. That's not going to feed the world, by the way. It's going to feed a lot of people who like salads, and it's important that we reduce food miles, but there's a lot of economic analytics that needs to be applied to some of these high input agriculture systems that are proposed. You're not going to get your bread and your milk and your whatever from those types of systems. So it is a massive diversity of investment sources. Some of the very big US seed companies and some in Australia as well are starting to invest in those spaces, and there's people investing in satellite technology. So it's a broad range of technologies, but there are ones that are probably not going to solve our bulk food problems, but more our, high value clientele kind of problems that we like to, buy lettuce or wheatgrass or something like that. Yep.
Great, thank you. Question from Colin. Do you ever foresee a day where agriculture is fully automated?
Pretty close, I think. Depends, not all aspects of agriculture. And certainly not all those people who want to run a hobby farm. I mean, you're still going to do a lot of stuff yourself because you're going to go, oh, that's the way I used to do it. And I love doing it. And there's a lot of things to enjoy about things that are done on farms. But there are very big opportunities to automate pretty much everything. I mean, John Deere and Holland and those other big manufacturers, they have autonomous tractors. It's really about policy regulation at the moment to allow those to happen. And I guess what I would like to see, if I can go on for a second, is that, there's a lot of discussion about hydrogen at the moment. So you imagine some of these big farms, they could make investments in solar farms. They could start to produce energy that will allow them to make liquid hydrogen and make their own ammonia. We've got a problem at the moment. We don't have enough fertilizer in this country, and we don't have additives for our diesel because we can't import enough urea because there's a worldwide shortage of urea. And we can make it. You can make it on your farm. GRDC are actually investing in some startups that are working on exactly that. But in theory, you could make the fertilizer and you can make the fuel to put in your fuel cell tractor. And I tell you, once a farmer starts driving an electric tractor, you'll never get them off it because serious amount of torque in an electric motor, and they'll perform extremely well as tractors. And there's already there aren't really many on the market, but that's coming. So I think the autonomy is a matter of time, and it's really a matter of people deciding, I don't need to sit on my tractor all day listening to cricket, because that's what you can do at the moment. Well, you can do it. You can still sit on a tractor. Just don't drive the thing. Let it drive itself.
I feel the same way about cars in the future.
Yeah, exactly. Me too.
Question, and I'm not sure if this person is paranoid or just wants to know, but is from John, are there new satellite technologies coming that will have much higher resolution?
Indeed. If I told you, they'd have to shoot me. Now, of course there are. I mean, there are some big resolution satellites. There are several. There's a lot of interest in that. A few people might know about Planet or Sky. What's it called? SkySat. Those satellites are these little cubes that are essentially an iPhone in a box, right? But highly tuned. There are more and more being put up. There's a lot of them there, and we're able to make a lot of use of the data that comes from them. I don't know exactly what resolutions they can get, and you'd have to be in the military, I think, to know that. But probably pretty impressive, I suppose. But we're mostly interested in the bands that are not just the visible ones. So we're not trying to look at pictures of people. We're trying to look at how plants are reflecting radiation, because that tells us about how healthy they are, in our case anyway.
Leave the people watching to
Leave the people watching
the
to
other
someone else.
organisation.
To the people with the drones.
Yeah.
That's right.
I'm going to ask you just 2 more quick questions before we wrap up. So one just question here is around Australian copyright law. Another was interesting is are copyright laws hindering AI and machine learning with IP protection of data sets that are not in the public domain? Is that an issue at all for you?
Somewhat. Data sets are a challenge. So some of the big corporates are collecting amazing data sets which are not easily shared. But I would have to say in data science, and I would need to ask some of my colleagues to comment more on this from UQ, but there's a real tradition in data science and computer science to publish in these conferences and to publish everything. So most of the algorithms that are used by the big media companies are not necessarily uniquely patented. I mean, they might tune it and patent it, but a huge amount of innovation in computer science is actually publicly available. So it's a lot easier to make this publicly available. Of course, as a university, we have to responsibly assess, and with our funding partners, when they're helping invest in our research, we do have to assess whether we should be looking at an IP position for some of these. But most of our technology, the vast majority of it, is available to people who need it. And that's why we're putting up those public data sets. Like we ran a Kaggle competition with 2,500 teams, all competing with each other to show us how good they could count weed heads. That was more teams than Facebook got when they put one of those up a few years ago. So we had all kinds of insights as to really clever people who solved problems for us, and it had to be public. So we got all the answers.
Great. Well, my last question for you then is, what's the next big thing for you? I mean, it sounds like $150 or $200 for a camera is pretty much all the tech we could ever possibly want. But you know, if you were going ham, what's on your Christmas wish list?
I really want to get Ross's bulldozers working, but not not as bulldozers. I don't know. There's so many exciting opportunities. I'll take the opportunity to mention another piece of tech that I love, which isn't probably my highest priority, but I love it, is we've got a wonderful guy over in engineering, Alexander Rakic. Alex is fantastic. He's the research outreach guy for the engineering group. And he works on terahertz imaging. And terahertz imaging is that stuff where you put your hands up in the airport, right? And it sees whether you've got something in your pockets. And he's gotten interested in the idea of being able to look at plants with this. And he showed me some pictures one day. I said, "What the hell's that?" He said, "Oh, that's just, a bamboo we had in the office." And I said, "Well, let's go and get some real plants. As crop physiologists, we know what's going on." And anyway, they did some of the tomato plant, which was better. And they could watch this tomato plant at really super fine resolution. Because this thing, basically, you can imagine, it can see the surface of a coin, or it can detect it very small through something, like it can see through. So you can tune it. And we got a little video, which I should have put in my talk, where we could see a leaf drying out, and we could see the water actually moving in and out of the leaf. And it's a really cool piece of tech. So I'd love to get that working as a cool piece of tech, but as a more pragmatic, big impact tech, maybe we need to get those autonomous tractors going. So.
I like it. Well, cool tech is definitely something we all want for Christmas. So I'm sure you're going to have a great Christmas, training up your visual camera to count presents quickly under the tree, simplify everything. In the meantime, we just have a very small gift. You can't image with terahertz imaging ahead of time. You'll have to wait to Christmas to open it. But thank you so much, Scott, for your insights this evening. We really appreciate your time. And thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you all next year. Congratulations.
Thanks very much, Joel. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.